Father made his own 15-year-old daughter pregnant, but the truth behind it will make your blood run cold. Evelyn stood frozen in place, staring down at the small plastic stick in her hand. The two faint pink lines stared back at her, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. A pregnancy test. Positive. Her fingers tightened around the test, the plastic biting into her skin, but she barely noticed. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on her, suffocating her with disbelief. This can't be real, her mind whispered. Not Lila. She swallowed hard, trying to push the panic back down, but it was already clawing its way up her throat. The neat, quiet world she'd built for her family was crumbling, and she didn't even know where to start picking up the pieces. Lila, she called, her voice sharper than she intended, echoing down the hall. There was no answer. She called again, louder this time, her heart pounding in her chest. Lila, come here. A shuffle of feet followed, and soon Lila appeared at the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide. The sight of her daughter, so young and unknowing, made Evelyn's heart clench with a mix of anger and sorrow. How could this have happened? Sit down, Evelyn demanded, her voice steady but laced with tension. She placed the pregnancy test on the coffee table between them, and Lila's gaze immediately dropped to it. The girl's face drained of color, and she stood frozen in place. Mama, Lila whispered, her voice barely audible, a tremor of fear in it. Evelyn's eyes were cold, her body stiff with fury. Sit down. Her tone left no room for argument, and Lila slowly obeyed, her hands twisting in her lap. For a long, painful moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, the sound of her own heartbeat roaring in her ears. She looked at Lila, really looked at her, and all the small things she'd ignored over the last few months came flooding back. Lila had been wearing loose clothes for weeks now, clothes that swallowed her slender frame. At first, Evelyn had thought it was just a phase, some kind of teenage rebellion against her usual tidy appearance. But now it made sense. The way Lila had avoided looking at her lately, how she'd been spending more time alone in her room, skipping meals, and the way her body had seemed to fill out, the slight roundness that Evelyn had refused to acknowledge until now. It all added up to this moment. How long? Evelyn's voice broke the silence, her words clipped and cold. She didn't look away from Lila's face, watching the tears well up in her daughter's eyes. Lila opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated. Her bottom lip trembled as she finally choked out, 3 months. I'm 3 months pregnant. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. 3 months. Her hands balled into fists on her lap, her knuckles white. 3 months, and you didn't say a word? Lila couldn't meet her mother's gaze. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she stammered, I didn't know how to tell you, Mama. I was scared. I didn't mean for this to happen. The anger building inside Evelyn reached its peak. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room, her mind racing with a whirlwind of questions. How could her daughter, her 15-year-old daughter, be pregnant? After everything they had taught her about faith, purity, respect, how could she have let this happen? You were scared? Evelyn snapped, turning back to face her daughter. You were scared, so you thought hiding it would make it better? You thought lying to me to your father was the answer? Lila wept, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her guilt. I didn't want to disappoint you. Well, you have. Evelyn's voice broke, the anger now tinged with raw pain. She had never imagined this. This wasn't the life they had planned for Lila. A girl raised in a devout Catholic home. A girl who knew better. They had brought her up with clear values, instilled a strong moral compass. They were Catholics who went to church every Sunday, prayed together every night. This wasn't supposed to happen. Evelyn sat back down, burying her face in her hands. Who is it? She asked, her voice muffled. Who did this to you? Lila hesitated again, her voice a fragile whisper. Mama? I don't know. I'm not sure who the father is. The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Her head snapped up, eyes blazing with disbelief. What do you mean you don't know? How can you not know? Lila was shaking now, her sobs uncontrollable. I don't remember, Mama. I had too much to drink. I don't even know how it happened. Evelyn, upon hearing her daughter's confession, gets up from a jump from where she was sitting next to her daughter, and looking at her says loudly, possible to all that she had said over the years since she was a little girl. The young woman does not respond to what her mother is saying to her. She only cries out of shame. But the worst part of the news hadn't even hit her yet. The part that would make Evelyn explode once and for all. There was one thing she was almost sure of. She stood up from the couch in a rush, her hands shaking as she turned to Lila. "It was that boyfriend of yours, wasn't it?" she said sharply. "Call that boyfriend of yours. I need to talk to him. Let's see what happened," says, grabbing the phone of the house. Seeing the attitude of his mother, Leela looks at her and tells her that her boyfriend is not at home, that he went on a trip with his family several months ago, so he had not communicated with him. Evelyn's eyes widened, but before she could say anything more, they both heard the sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed with confusion at the tense atmosphere. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between his wife and daughter. Evelyn's face twisted in anguish as she pointed at Lila. "How can I not scream with what I've just learned?" she shouted, her voice trembling. "This 15-year-old girl, who's barely a child, is pregnant." Marcus's face paled, and for a moment he stood motionless, unable to comprehend what his wife had just said. Lila sat hunched over, her head buried in her hands, crying uncontrollably. "How did this happen?" Marcus finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's expression darkened. "The little boyfriend is the culprit," she snapped, her anger boiling over. "That's who convinced her. I'm sure of it." She turned to Lila, her voice cold and unforgiving. "Answer me, Lila. Didn't I tell you that you should come home pure to your marriage? That you needed to be careful?" Lila couldn't respond. Her sobs drowned out any words she might have said. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the floor, his mind piecing together fragments of information, trying to make sense of it all. He was overcome with guilt, thinking about everything they'd taught her, everything they believed. Suddenly, without realizing it, he muttered, "I got her pregnant." His voice barely audible as he shook his head, looking at the ground, overwhelmed by his own thoughts and confusion. For a few seconds, the whole world was paralyzed. Evelyn could not believe what she was hearing. Marcus's voice had been barely a whisper, but the impact of those words sent shockwaves through Evelyn's entire being. Her heart seemed to seize, her mind frozen in disbelief. She stared at Marcus as if he were a stranger. The man she had built her life with, the father of her child, her only child, had just confessed to something beyond her wildest fears. "You," Evelyn's voice cracked, trembling with a mixture of rage and devastation. "How? How can you say that? How can you be the father of Lila's child? She's your daughter." Her voice broke into a scream, her hand instinctively reaching to the side, clutching at the nearest chair as if it would keep her upright, her knuckles turning white from the grip. Marcus couldn't meet her eyes. He stared down at the floor, his face pale and drained of life. "I don't know how it happened," he mumbled, his words almost swallowed by the weight of the room. "That night, her 15th birthday, I was drunk, too drunk. I thought I was in our room." The horrifying realization set in, and Evelyn's entire body trembled with fury. "No," she screamed. "No, you don't get to say that. You don't get to excuse this monstrosity with some excuse of being drunk." Lila, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, her face buried in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, now cried even louder, her whole body shaking. The sound of her daughter's sorrow only fueled Evelyn's rage. She felt like an animal, cornered, unable to escape the horror that had become her life. Evelyn's hand moved to the phone on the table. She picked it up with trembling fingers, her breath coming in short, furious gasps. "I can't live with you anymore. I don't even know who you are," she said, her voice cracking. "You're a monster who did the unthinkable to his own daughter." Marcus finally looked up, panic flashing in his eyes as he saw Evelyn dialing. "Evelyn, please," he began, stepping forward, but she pointed a shaking finger at him. "Don't you come near me," she shrieked. "Don't you dare come near me or her again." She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice lowering but filled with venom. "You don't deserve to live under this roof. I'm calling the police. I'll tell them everything. And God willing, they'll kill you for what you've done. You're no husband. You're no father. No." Lila's voice, weak and broken, barely escaped her lips. "Mama, please don't do this." She looked at her mother with tear-streaked eyes, pleading silently. But Evelyn was already speaking to the authorities, her words clipped and cold. I want to report a crime. Yes, it's an emergency. My husband, he's done something unforgivable. I want him gone. Marcus stood frozen in the room, his face ashen, his world collapsing around him. He knew there was no going back from this. The life he had ruined was not just his own. It was Lila's, Evelyn's. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a crushing boulder. And he felt hollow, unable to defend himself. Evelyn's words to the police were sharp and precise. My husband, he's a monster. He's the father of my daughter's child. Yes, our daughter. I don't care what you have to do, just take him away. If you have to shoot him, shoot him. He's not a man, he's an animal. Within minutes, the sound of police sirens filled the quiet street outside, the flashing blue lights casting long shadows across the walls. The house, once a place of warmth and faith, now felt cold and hollow. There was a knock at the door, and 2 officers clad in dark uniforms stepped into the room. Mrs. Martinez? One of them asked, glancing between Evelyn and Marcus. The tension in the room was palpable. We received a report about an incident here. Evelyn stood, her eyes not leaving Marcus's figure, who remained frozen in place. That's him, she said, her voice now hoarse from the yelling. Take him away. He's the father of my daughter's baby. The officers' expressions hardened, and they moved toward Marcus, one of them reaching for the handcuffs. Marcus didn't resist. He didn't say a word as they took his wrists and fastened the cuffs with a metallic click. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his guilt visibly crushing him. As they led him toward the door, Marcus turned, his eyes finally meeting Lila's tear-streaked face. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking as he spoke. Lila, he said softly, I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I was confused, drunk, but that's no excuse. I know I hurt you. I know I hurt your mother. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know, I loved you always. I'm so sorry. Evelyn's body shaking as she turned to Marcus, her face red with rage. Get out, she screamed. Get out of this house before they come. If I have to see you for another second, I'll kill you myself. As the officers escorted Marcus through the front door, Evelyn stood rooted to the spot, watching him disappear from her life. Her chest heaved with heavy breaths, her eyes burning with unshed tears. The storm of emotions that had raged through her was now replaced by a dull, empty ache. The door clicked shut behind them, and the house was plunged into silence once more. Evelyn collapsed into the chair, her hands covering her face. The rage that had sustained her moments before was gone, replaced by an unbearable sorrow. Lila's sobs filled the room, and after what felt like an eternity, Evelyn finally turned to her daughter. Her anger subsided, but the pain was still raw. She knelt in front of Lila, placing a trembling hand on her daughter's shoulder. I'm sorry, Lila whispered through her tears. Mama, I'm so sorry. Evelyn pulled Lila into her arms, hugging her tightly. It's not your fault, she said, her voice soft now, filled with a sadness that no words could capture. It's not your fault, my child. You didn't ask for any of this. For the first time in what felt like months, Lila allowed herself to feel safe in her mother's embrace. The weight of what had happened, of what her father had done, still lingered. But in this moment, there was a fragile understanding between them, a fragile bond of survival. I want to keep the baby, Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. Evelyn pulled back slightly, looking at her daughter's tear-streaked face, confused. What? Lila's eyes, though filled with tears, held a glimmer of something stronger, something like hope. The baby, it didn't do anything wrong. I don't know how it happened, but I believe there's a reason. Maybe it's God's will. I want to keep it, Mama. I have to. Evelyn's heart ached. She had spent so long believing that this pregnancy was a punishment, a curse for something unspoken. But hearing Lila speak with such conviction, such quiet determination, shook her to the core. The thought of this child, born from such confusion, from such betrayal, had felt like a weight too heavy to bear. But maybe Lila was right. Maybe this was God's way of giving them something, someone to love through the pain. Evelyn cupped her daughter's face gently. If that's what you want, she said softly, her voice filled with both sadness and acceptance, then we will. We'll keep the baby. Lila nodded, her tears slowing as she leaned into her mother's embrace once again. The months passed slowly, each day bringing Lila closer to the inevitable reality of her pregnancy. Despite everything, the bond between mother and daughter strengthened in those months. There was something about the growing life that brought them closer. Evelyn could see Lila's love for the unborn child growing each day, and slowly Evelyn too found herself softening toward the baby. No matter what had happened, no matter the pain and confusion that still lingered, the baby was innocent. One evening as Lila sat on the couch, her hands resting gently on her swollen belly, she whispered to her mother, "Mama, do you think I'm doing the right thing? Keeping the baby?" Evelyn looked at her daughter, her heart aching with the weight of the question. She sat down next to Lila, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think," she said slowly, "that God has a plan for everything. This baby didn't ask to come into the world like this, but maybe this is part of a bigger reason. I don't know why it happened, but I do know that love will guide us through." Lila nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I've thought of a name for him," she whispered. "Oh?" Evelyn's voice was gentle, her eyes softening. "I want to name him Asher," Lila said, her voice filled with a fragile hope. "We could call him Asher, like the little angel he is." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She reached out, placing her hand over Lila's. "Asher, it's perfect." Months later, the day of Asher's birth arrived. The labor had been long and exhausting, but the moment Lila heard his first cry, a wave of relief and love washed over her. Evelyn stood by her side, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter so vulnerable yet so strong. And when she saw the baby, tiny, fragile, and perfect, Evelyn's heart melted. The room was quiet, the soft sounds of the hospital drifting in the background. Lila held Asher in her arms, staring at his little face in awe. Evelyn leaned in, her voice a gentle whisper. "Look at him," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He looks just like you did when you were born." Lila smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Mama," she said softly, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." Evelyn looked at her daughter, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it, my love?" Lila hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced down at Asher, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, and then back at her mother. "I've been afraid to tell you. About the night Asher was conceived." Evelyn felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. She sat down beside Lila, her hand resting on her daughter's arm. "Tell me," she whispered. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." Lila took a deep breath, her voice shaking. "It was the night of my 15th birthday party. Adrian and we drank too much. I was so drunk by the end of the night that I don't even remember how I got into my bed. He helped me up to my room, but then someone else came in." Evelyn's heart raced as she listened to her daughter's words, piecing together the fragments of that terrible night. She remembered Marcus's confession, how he had been drunk too, how he had stumbled up to the second floor, thinking he was entering their bedroom. "I never saw the face of the person in my bed, Mama," Lila whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know who it was." A heavy silence filled the room. Evelyn sat frozen, her mind spinning. Could it have been Marcus after all, or was it someone else entirely? She looked down at Asher, the innocent baby. "We need to know the truth," Evelyn finally said, her voice firm. "We need to do a DNA test. If he's the father, we will deal with it, but we need to know for sure." Lila nodded, her eyes filled with tears. Evelyn wrapped her arms around Lila, holding her close. "No matter what happens, we'll get through this together. You're not alone." As the law required, a DNA test was conducted on Asher, with Marcus's sample compared to the baby's. The waiting felt like an eternity. Finally, the results came back. Marcus was not the father. The results were clear. 99% certainty. He was not the man who had fathered Asher. Evelyn's hands shook as she read the report, her breath catching in her throat. Relief washed over her, but with it came confusion. If it wasn't Marcus, then who? The police released Marcus shortly after the results came in. The charges against him dropped. The day Marcus returned home, the air in the house felt different. There was tension, but there was also a fragile hope, something that hadn't been there in months. Evelyn stood by the door as he walked in, his face gaunt and weary, but his eyes softened when they met hers. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung between them like a storm waiting to break. Evelyn swallowed hard, the anger and pain she had held onto for so long beginning to melt away. She stepped toward him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for his. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry." Marcus' eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, he let himself break. He pulled Evelyn into his arms, holding her tightly as the tears slipped down his face. "I'm sorry too," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I had ruined everything." For a long moment they just held each other, the months of pain and confusion slowly being replaced by something else, something like forgiveness. "I thought I was the father, Evelyn," Marcus said softly, his voice trembling. "The dates, they lined up. I was so sure I had done something terrible that night. I couldn't bear the thought of someone else being responsible, so I convinced myself it had to be me." He paused, his grip tightening on her hand. "But I thank God every day that I didn't fall into the devil's trap. If I had done that to our daughter, if I had hurt Lila in that way, I couldn't have lived with myself. I would have ended it." Evelyn pulled back slightly, looking into his eyes. Her heart ached for the man she loved, the man who had carried such a heavy burden all this time. "But you didn't," she said softly. "You didn't, Marcus, and we're going to get through this together." Lila, standing in the corner of the room with Asher, cradled in her arms, watched the scene unfold, her heart heavy with emotion. She had spent so many nights wondering if her family could ever be whole again, but seeing her parents now, holding each other, forgiving each other, gave her a glimmer of hope. "Lila," Marcus whispered, turning to his daughter for the first time since he had walked through the door. His eyes softened as he stepped toward her. Can I hold him?" Lila's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at Asher, his tiny face peaceful in sleep, and nodded slowly. "Of course," she whispered, her voice shaking as she carefully placed the baby in her father's arms. Marcus held his grandson for the first time, his hands trembling slightly as he cradled the small, fragile life in his arms. His heart swelled with love and sorrow, but most of all, gratitude. He looked down at Asher's face, his tiny hands curled into fists, and whispered a prayer of thanks. "Thank you, God," he murmured, "for keeping me from going down that dark path. If I had, I would never have forgiven myself." Lila watched her father with tears in her eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace. She stepped forward, and without hesitation, Marcus pulled her into the embrace, holding his daughter and grandson close to him. Evelyn joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them, and for the first time since the nightmare began, the family felt whole again. After a few moments, Marcus pulled away slightly, his expression turning more serious. "But we still have a question to answer," he said softly, looking between Evelyn and Lila. "If I'm not the father, then who is?" Lila lowered her gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She still didn't know who had come into her room that night, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on her. Marcus kissed the top of her head, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm going to find out, Lila. I'm going to make sure whoever did this pays for dishonoring you." As the days passed, Marcus began his own quiet investigation. He questioned neighbors, teachers, anyone who had been around during the weeks leading up to Lila's birthday. But every avenue he pursued led to dead ends. No one knew anything. No one had answers. The truth, it seemed, was still out of reach, and with each passing day, the mystery of Asher's father weighed heavier on their hearts, threatening to unravel everything they had fought so hard to rebuild. One evening, after another fruitless day of questioning, Marcus sat down at the kitchen table, his hands running through his graying hair. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Lila sat across from him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if we never find out?" she whispered, her voice small. Marcus looked at her, his heart aching for the pain she had carried for so long. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We will, Lila," he said softly. "We will find out who did this, and they will pay for what they've done, I promise you." Suddenly there was a knock at the door, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Evelyn and Marcus exchanged a brief glance before Evelyn slowly stood to answer it. When the door creaked open, there stood Adrian, Lila's boyfriend. "Adrian," Lila whispered, her voice filled with surprise and relief. Adrian stepped inside, his face flushed, but there was a calmness in his movements. He looked directly at Lila, then at her parents. "I just got back yesterday," he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "I had no idea what had happened while I was gone. I didn't know about the baby until I got home." Lila's heart raced as she looked at him, her emotions conflicted but overwhelmingly glad to see him. "You? You didn't know?" she asked, almost breathless. "No," Adrian replied, stepping further into the room. "My family left the morning after your birthday party. We had to deal with some family issues in another city, and I didn't hear anything from anyone. I didn't know about the baby until I came home, and as soon as I found out, I came here to see you." Adrian's face flushed with guilt, and he glanced at Lila, his heart aching. He took a deep breath, knowing that what he had to say would change everything. "Mrs. Martinez, I need to tell you the truth about that night. Lila and I were drinking. It was her birthday and we got carried away. We both drank too much, more than we should have." He paused, looking down for a moment, then back up at Lila. "I was dizzy and not thinking straight, and so was she. I helped her to her room because she could barely walk, and then I left her to go check on the rest of the party." Lila's eyes were wide, her hands trembling as she remembered that night. She had been so drunk, the details blurred, the memories hazy. "I thought she'd be okay," Adrian continued, his voice thick with regret. "But I came back to check on her later, and that's when it happened." He looked directly at Marcus and Evelyn, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "I had relations with Lila that night. I was drunk. She was drunk. I'm not proud of it, but it's the truth. I didn't know she was pregnant. I swear, if I had known, I would have come back right away." The room was silent. Lila felt her heart pounding in her chest as the full truth finally came out. She had been too afraid, too uncertain to confront the details of that night. But now it was all laid bare. Her parents stood motionless, processing Adrian's confession. "You," Evelyn began, her voice trembling. "You did this. You're responsible for this." Marcus's reaction was immediate. His fists clenched and his voice rose with fury. "You took advantage of my daughter when she was drunk, you—" "No," Adrian interrupted, his voice firm but desperate. "I didn't take advantage of her. We were both drunk and it just happened. I didn't force anything on her. I love Lila. I always have." Lila's voice finally broke through the tension, soft but pleading. "Mama, Papa, please. I love him. We didn't mean for this to happen, but I don't want to do this alone." Evelyn's stern expression faltered as she looked at her daughter, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. Lila's plea was genuine, and it broke her heart to see her daughter in such a state. "You say you love her?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft but laced with disappointment. "But love isn't carelessness, Adrian. You left her with no idea of what would happen next. You left her to deal with this alone." Adrian shook his head, his eyes filled with guilt. "I didn't mean to, Mrs. Martinez. If I had known, I would never have left. But now that I do know, I'm here. I'm not running away. I want to take responsibility for Lila and the baby." Marcus, his face tight with anger, took a step closer to Adrian. "You think it's that easy? You think you can just waltz back in here and fix everything? This isn't a mistake you can just undo, Adrian. You've caused pain. You've disrupted our family." "I know I have," Adrian said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "And I'm sorry. I'm not trying to undo what happened. I'm trying to do what's right now. I'm here because I love Lila and I want to be a father to the baby. I'm 18 now. I'm of age, and I'm not afraid to take on this responsibility." Adrian barely had time to register Marcus's movement before he felt the older man's hand grab the front of his shirt, yanking him forward with a force that left him breathless. In one swift motion, Marcus shoved Adrian toward the door, his voice booming with anger. "You think you can just walk back in here and act like nothing happened?" Marcus growled, his face red with fury. "You ruined my daughter's life, Adrian. You don't get to just say sorry and expect us to forgive you." Adrian stumbled, catching himself just before he fell. But he didn't retaliate. He looked up at Marcus, his expression resolute, even as he stood at the edge of the doorstep. "I understand you're angry, Mr. Martinez," Adrian said, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. "But I'm not leaving, not until we figure this out." Just as Marcus was about to push Adrian further, there was another knock at the door. Evelyn, who had been watching the scene unfold in tense silence, moved to answer it. When she opened the door, she was greeted by the sight of Adrian's parents, standing on the porch with worried expressions. "Mrs. Martinez." "Mr. Martinez," Adrian's father said, his tone serious but measured. "We need to talk." Marcus stepped back, his face still tight with anger, but he motioned for them to come in. Evelyn nodded stiffly, allowing them to enter the living room. There was an uncomfortable silence as the two families stood across from one another, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. "First of all, we're here to apologize," Adrian's mother began, her voice trembling slightly. "We had no idea what was going on between Adrian and Lila. We didn't know about the baby until Adrian told us. But now that we do, we want to make this right." Marcus crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "We want Adrian to be a part of the baby's life," Adrian's father replied, his tone firm. "We know mistakes were made and we're not excusing them, but Adrian is ready to take responsibility. He loves Lila and he wants to help raise their child. We came here to find a solution that works for both families." Evelyn, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, glanced at Lila, who was sitting quietly, her hands resting on her lap. Lila hadn't said much since Adrian's return, her emotions swirling in a confusing mix of relief and uncertainty. Before either family could respond, a soft cry echoed from upstairs. It was Asher, his little voice, breaking the tension in the room. Lila immediately stood, her maternal instincts taking over. "I'll get him," she whispered, excusing herself and heading upstairs. The room fell into a heavy silence as Lila disappeared, and everyone's attention shifted back to the conversation. Marcus's eyes flicked toward Adrian, still standing near the door. "You really think you're ready for this?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter now, but still laced with doubt. "Raising a child is no small task. It's not something you can walk away from when it gets tough." "I know," Adrian replied, his voice steady. "I'm not walking away. I'm here for the long haul, Mr. Martinez, for Lila and for the Babti." Just then, Lila reappeared, cradling Asher in her arms. The baby's cries had softened to small whimpers as she gently rocked him. The sight of her holding the child, their child, brought a moment of quiet reflection to the room. Adrian's parents had yet to see the baby, and as Lila slowly approached, their eyes filled with emotion. Adrian's mother took a step forward, her hand covering her mouth as she whispered, "Oh my, is that him?" Lila nodded, her expression soft but weary. "This is Asher." Adrian stepped closer, his eyes locked on the small squirming figure in Lila's arms. His heart raced as he reached out, his hands trembling slightly. Can I hold him?" he asked, his voice filled with both anticipation and fear. Lila hesitated for a moment but then nodded. Carefully, she transferred the baby into Adrian's waiting arms. The moment Asher settled against his chest, his cries stopped. The room fell silent as everyone watched in awe. The baby, who had been restless moments before, now stared up at Adrian with wide, curious eyes. "He stopped crying," Evelyn whispered, almost in disbelief. Adrian smiled, his eyes filling with tears as he gazed down at his son. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice soft. "I'm your dad." As if sensing the significance of the moment, Asher lifted his tiny hand and touched Adrian's face, his fingers brushing against his cheek. The baby let out a small giggle, his eyes twinkling as if he recognized the man holding him. Adrian's heart swelled with emotion, his grip on the child tightening just slightly as tears blurred his vision. "He's beautiful," Adrian whispered, looking at Lila with awe. "He has your eyes, Lila, and Asher. That's a perfect name." The room seemed shift in that moment. Evelyn and Marcus, who had been so firm in their stance, felt the ice around their hearts begin to thaw. Seeing Adrian hold his son, seeing the way Asher responded to him, made it harder to maintain their anger. But even so, the pain of the past months couldn't simply disappear. "Adrian," Marcus began, his voice softer now, "you've caused a lot of hurt. You left my daughter when she needed you most, and I'm not ready to forgive that." Evelyn, standing beside Marcus, looked at Adrian, her expression still conflicted. "We'll allow you to see Asher," she said slowly. "But this doesn't mean we accept you back into Lila's life. Not yet. You'll need to prove yourself, Adrian, to all of us." Adrian nodded, his heart full of determination. "I will. I'll do whatever it takes." As he looked down at Asher, still nestled peacefully in his arms, Adrian felt a surge of hope. The house had grown quieter since Adrian started visiting regularly. His presence, once met with cold suspicion, had slowly become a part of the daily rhythm, especially as he took on more responsibility for Asher's care. He arrived early in the mornings, sometimes even before the sun had risen, ready to help Lila with the baby. He changed diapers, rocked Asher to sleep, and fed him without a single word of complaint. Evelyn would watch from the kitchen window as Adrian quietly hummed to Asher, pacing the backyard as the baby napped against his chest. Though she didn't say much, Evelyn's eyes softened over time, her heart slowly opening to the young man who had once been the source of her greatest pain. But it wasn't until the day Asher fell ill that everything changed. It started like any other afternoon. Lila was in the living room with her parents, and Adrian had just finished feeding Asher his lunch. The baby had been fussier than usual, but no one thought much of it. That was until Asher's skin grew pale, his tiny body unusually still. When Lila picked him up, he was burning with fever. Panic swept through the house. Lila's face turned white with fear and Evelyn's hands trembled as she tried to soothe her daughter. Marcus stood frozen, helpless, as Lila held the baby close to her chest. But Adrian sprang into action. Without a second thought, he scooped Asher from Lila's arms and rushed toward the door. "We need to get him to the hospital," Adrian said urgently, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Adrian didn't speak much, his focus solely on getting them there as quickly as possible. Lila sat in the back seat, tears streaming down her face as she watched her baby struggle to breathe. She felt powerless, her heart breaking with every second that passed. Once at the hospital, Adrian stayed by Lila's side through it all. He held her hand as they waited for the doctors to examine Asher, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. When Lila felt like she couldn't hold herself together, it was Adrian who kept her grounded, who reminded her that they were in this together. Asher spent several nights in the hospital, fighting off an infection that had come on suddenly. Those were the longest nights of Lila's life, but Adrian never left her side. He paced the hospital hallways with her, sat silently when she needed quiet, and stayed awake through the night, always ready to help in any way he could. Evelyn and Marcus watched it all unfold. They saw the way Adrian handled every crisis with calm and care, the way he supported Lila and was endlessly patient with their grandson. They had been cautious, guarded with their emotions, but as the days passed, something in them began to change. One evening, while Lila and Adrian sat by Asher's bedside, Evelyn and Marcus stood in the doorway, their eyes meeting. Marcus sighed softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's proven himself, hasn't he?" Evelyn nodded, her heart heavy, but also relieved. When Asher finally recovered and the family returned home, the mood in the house was different. There was a newfound warmth, a quiet understanding that had grown between them all. Evelyn no longer viewed Adrian as an outsider, and Marcus's once fierce skepticism had softened. As the months passed, Adrian continued to visit daily, and each day the bond between him, Lila, and Asher grew stronger. Slowly but surely, the family began to heal, the fractures of the past mending with time and forgiveness. Then 1 year later, Adrian did something that changed everything again. He asked Marcus and Evelyn if he could speak with them privately. There was a seriousness in his eyes that made them both sit up a little straighter. "I wanted to ask for your permission," Adrian began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I love Lila with all my heart, and I love Asher like he's the most precious thing in this world. I want to make Lila the happiest woman in the world, and I want to marry her. But before I ask her, I need to know that I have your blessing." Evelyn's eyes welled up with tears. She had watched this young man grow into someone she never thought he could be, strong, responsible, and kind. Marcus, his expression serious, looked at Adrian for a long moment. Then finally, he nodded. "If you promise to take care of her, to protect her and Asher, then you have my blessing," Marcus said, his voice softening. "I promise," Adrian said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'll make sure Lila is the happiest she's ever been." That evening, with both families gathered around, Adrian knelt before Lila. The room fell silent as he took her hand, his eyes filled with love and certainty. "Lila," he said softly. Will you marry me? Lila's eyes filled with tears as she looked around at her family, her parents, Asher, and the man who had stood by her through it all. With a trembling smile, she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had once doubted them, Adrian and Lila found their way back to each other, stronger and more united than ever. The journey had been long and painful, but they had made it through, together. Wow, what an intense and heartbreaking journey this family went through. The story was filled with betrayal, pain, and moments that seemed impossible to heal from. But in the end, God's grace shined through. He helped them find forgiveness, heal their wounds, and piece their lives back together. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how dark things get, there is always hope and the possibility of redemption. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in their situation? Do you think forgiveness came too easily, or was it the only way to truly move forward? Drop your comments below, and let's talk about it. Thank you all for watching, and if this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I can't wait to dive into the next story with you all.